A pleasant welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I trust I find you very well, and thank God that you are very safe. My name is Roderick Mfumbazi. I'm one of the organizers of the Rapid Economic Recovery Response, Part 1. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to all the people coming from the 47 countries, streaming live from all over the world. We appreciate your time and your commitment to seeing this rapid economic recovery through. Now, our procedure guidelines today are very simple. We kindly ask you to mute your microphones at all times. And if you have any questions, feel free to make use of our live Q&A box. Now, to kickstart our session, we'd like to get your views and thoughts on the current crisis that is affecting you on your business on a daily basis. So we're going to conduct an exercise that we'll get your thoughts and views upon what you're facing every day, and we'll kindly ask you as well to give your vote as well in terms of what your thoughts are. So after that, then I'll give you the feedback as well. So you'll be able to see the poll. I'm going to start now asking if you all can see it. I'll start the question. So we want to find out, how optimistic are you about your business rapidly recovering post-COVID-19 crisis? So we want to know if you are A, not optimistic, 2, you are somewhat optimistic, or you are very optimistic, or basically you're uncertain, because we really understand what this crisis is really affecting your own business. So in the next 45 seconds, I would now allow you to start your poll vote. Ladies and gentlemen, the poll begins now. You can start voting. Okay, thank you so much. I think we would appreciate now to see the feedback on your views and thoughts, because the reason you are here is to see a transformation. Okay, so we've got the poll results that just out now. Well, about 4% of you are not optimistic, and about 47% say somewhat optimistic, so you're in between. And only 33% are very, very optimistic, and about 18% are uncertain at all. So thank you so much for your feedback. This is very important. This will set precedent for the reason that you are here, and the great panel of speakers will give you a great transformation, and we believe you will get value today. So I'm going to leave proceedings to Mr. Denny Kiyondo, who's going to take you through the rest of the program. Over to you, Mr. Denny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roderick. And a very, very warm welcome to you all, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever across the African continent or the diaspora that you may be joining us, to what we believe will be a very engaging and very enlightening meeting. This is a forum about Africa, by Africa, for Africa. This is a forum that seeks to provide key insights going forward for a continent that is as rich in human as it is in natural resources. This is a dialogue that seeks to shed some light, not on how Africa can go back to normal, but how she can move forward to better. Africa must claim its seat at the table. Africa's narrative must and will change. And that change, ladies and gentlemen, begins with us, with you and I, who call this beautiful, diverse, richly endowed continent our home. Much of what has been said and written about Africa has been done by non-Africans. The name Africa has been made to become synonymous with dependency. But the fundamental question we need to start asking ourselves as Africans, is Africa really dependent on the West? Or is it the West that is in fact dependent on Africa? There's a quote I'd like to share with you, which says the following: as long as the lion does not know how to write, the story will always glorify the hunter. Africa is that sleeping lion. Africa needs to arise. Africa needs to begin to write its own story. Throughout the course of history, Africa and Africans have been called by many names. Few, if any at all, have been very complimentary. Africa's very identity has to a large extent been defined by factors outside of itself, which have consequently been tailored to suit an agenda also outside of itself. Even in the midst of the current global health crisis, the prophecies of doom and gloom concerning Africa continue to abound. It is time for Africa to come to its senses and emerge from its prodigal son mindset, rewrite its own story, and begin to change the status quo. Let's just be clear that there is no quick fix. It will require political will and collective buy-in. It is not an event, it is a process that will take time, but one that must be done intentionally and deliberately. It is time for Africa to believe that it can be better. It is time for Africa to believe that it can do better. It is time for Africa to rise above every negative label that has ever been placed on her, even by herself. We are very honored today to have with us a very distinguished panel of Africans, and it is my pleasure to now introduce them to you. They are Professor PLO LUMUMBA. He's a professor of public law and an advocate of the high courts of Kenya and Tanganyika. Professor LUMUMBA is a world-renowned speaker on African affairs. Mr. CUTHBERT NCUBE, CEO of Kwela Fleet Management and Chairperson of the African Tourism Board. Mr. NCUBE has sat on several regional and international tourism boards and has vast experience. Dr. Walter MZEMBI is president of the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, Africa chapter, and has held various senior positions in both the public and private sectors in Zimbabwe and internationally. CAREL MOTSHEGA is a true African entrepreneur. He is the founder and managing director of L Journey Group, a multidisciplinary company offering services in transport, logistics, and infrastructure development. CAREL is passionate about leadership and entrepreneurship, especially as it relates to the youth of Africa. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you very much for taking time out of your undoubtedly very busy schedules to be with us today. Our moderator for today is one of my closest and truest friends, whom I have known for most of my adult life. Doris Parsons is a corporate communications and conferencing expert and managing partner of SRC Agency, and we are delighted to have her moderate this dialogue. And so, without further ado, I will now hand over these proceedings to her. Welcome, Doris.
Who have taken the time. Sorry, I think I was speaking before. Let me start again. Thank you very much, Danny. I must say it is a privilege and honor to be hosting this highly anticipated session. First and foremost, I'd like to appreciate each and every single one of you who have taken the time this afternoon to join us. We are so very excited to have people join from Angola, from Australia, Benin, Bermuda, Botswana, with people from Cameroon, Canada, Chad, China, Eswatini, Ethiopia, with people from France, Gambia, Ghana, India, Italy, Jamaica, with people from Lesotho, Liberia, Namibia, from the Philippines, Portugal, Qatar, Rwanda, Sao Tome and Principe. We've got people from Saudi Arabia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Africa, South Sudan, Sweden, Tanzania, Trinidad and Tobago, Tunisia, with people from Uganda, UAE, UK, the USA, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. You see what I did there from A to Z. Yes, we have them all. Thank you so very much. So now you know who you are virtually sitting next to. So today we have an incredibly We have an incredibly vocal and passionate panel, each very influential speakers whenever they have the platform. And today, we are privileged to have them all in the one single platform. I am certainly looking forward to an exhilarating 90 minutes of insightful conversation with each and every single one of you, our panels. Now, COVID-19 has happened to the world. It's been unexpected and it has been unplanned. If anyone had asked you this time last year where you think you'd be this time in 2020, you would have never thought you'd be locked down, quarantined, socially distanced, and your business shaken to the very core. Now, whereas we cannot control what has happened to us, we can certainly control how we respond. What do we do? Where do we go from here? Now, these are some of the questions that our panelists will be addressing this afternoon. And I do hope that the conversations that we're going to have today will get us all on the path to rapid recovery for our businesses, for our organizations, and indeed for Africa. As we all know, COVID-19 was first identified in Wuhan, China, back in December 2019. And since then, 348,000 lives have been lost globally. Now, I would like to ask that we take a moment at this time to remember all those who have lost their lives and those who may be currently fighting for their lives. Let us take 5 seconds just to remember those who've lost their lives. Thank you. But also, let us celebrate the extraordinary men and women, doctors, nurses, the caregivers, the health workers, all those who have been in the front line, working tirelessly to save lives, even at the risk of their own. And today, we celebrate you. And now, let us go straight on to the business that has brought us here today. Now, rapid economic recovery. Whereas this may be a question that is pertinent across the continents, today's panelists will focus only on Africa. Now, just a little bit of context. Africa has suffered, Africa has suffered what we can call a double blow. Number one, the COVID-19 shock, which has been felt globally and even domestically within Africa. And number two, the economic shock. This has been caused by the various lockdowns across the nations, leading to a direct hit on our economies and our businesses. There's been a fall in demand of African commodities. Tourism has come to a complete halt, and trade that mostly depends on the Chinese imports has been forced to come to a standstill. So as a result, we've seen businesses being shut down, and those that are still standing are struggling to keep afloat. Unfortunately, many people have lost their jobs. They're having to face the very difficult question, how do we fend for our families? This is the question on everyone's minds. How will we survive? And this is why we're here today. Now, there will be a set of questions for each of our panelists to tackle, questions to which there are no easy answers, but I'm sure they will do their best to try and alleviate the concerns that each one of us might have. Now, as the saying goes, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Let us hope that at the end of this session, we will each walk away with that one step that we need to take to begin the journey of our road to recovery. So this leads me to our first question. Gentlemen, thank you so very much, first of all, for your time. It really is an honor for me to be here today moderating this session. And yeah, I hope I will be able to do it justice. We're looking forward to all that you have to share with each and every single one of us. And yes, let us start. Now, if we look at the aftermath of COVID-19 and the problems that have come about as a result, was this ever really Africa's problem, or was the problem imposed on Africa? Now, I understand this could potentially be a very controversial question, but it is nonetheless a very important one. And I'd like to start with you, Walter. What are your views on this? Was this really Africa's problem, or was it imposed on us? Walter?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good night, good evening to all Africans across the globe. It was Africa's problem to the extent that the world is now a global village. The ICT revolution makes it so. Africa is everywhere and not in a geographical location. our diaspora populations are scattered all over the world. And if I take a case in point, my own country, Zimbabwe, it has sponsored upwards of 40% of its total population in the diaspora. The returns on COVID deaths that we get on Zimbabwe may not include our frontline staff in NHS systems in the United Kingdom, in the United States of America, in Australasia, and elsewhere. But our people, Black people, Africans, have borne the brand as frontline state populations in the host countries where they are. So in a sense, yes, it was very much Africa's problem, to the extent that our people who are out there have been affected. And much of the tallies on deaths that we get on our people out there are not computed in national returns. They are computed in the countries where they have happened, but they are nevertheless Africans. But if you look at Africa in the geographical sense, it may, in hindsight, not indicate that it was Africa's problem, to the extent that Africa has been spared the brand of the devastating impact of coronavirus, in the sense that we have now come to know it, in as far as it has impacted the other epicenters that we now already know. So if you look today, Africa crossed the 100,000 threshold on the 23rd of May, with slightly over 3,180 deaths in 100,000. If you compare that to deaths elsewhere per million, in the United States, an average of 274, in Sweden, an average of 374 deaths per million, and going forward to countries like Ethiopia, which is inside Africa, with a population of in excess of 100 million, you will see the deaths per million actually decimalizing to 0.04%, which is roughly the African average. Now, if we use that and we take into consideration the global deaths per day and what is killing our people, if you refer to that table, you'd see that cardiovascular diseases are in the lead with 48,742, which is roughly about 33%. And cancers follow, all sorts of cancers, at 18% of global deaths per day. Your respiratory diseases, lower and upper, they constitute about 12%. Dementia and digestive diseases are at par at 5% apiece. And if you go down, you will see that what we have lost basically in Africa equates to the losses per day due to diabetes or maybe liver diseases. But the response itself to coronavirus has been actually more of the pandemic, in that it has left in its wake a lot of distressed families that were locked down, because Africa is an informal economy of up to 80%. And many of our countries responded not in the integrated fashion that we have come to know through the African Union's the Africa we want. They responded haphazardly. In fact, Africa itself started shutting borders to itself, shunning citizens from one country to another without regard to the promise that they've made in the African Union of an integrated, prosperous Africa that will pursue a sustainable, developed economy. We saw a lot of selective treatment, even within African economies, of Africans basically now treating their own citizens in exclusion to the rest of Africans. So yes, we have had a very devastating impact of this coronavirus, only to the extent of the decisions that we have taken ourselves as Africans in following hook, line, and sinker the prescribed lockdowns. But if you look at what has really impacted Africa, it is the knock-on effect from economic hits that have happened on China, that have happened on the United States of Africa, America, that have happened on Europe and Africa's main trading partners. That is what has hit Africa the most. The slump in key markets for raw materials, because Africa exports raw materials from your coffee to your brown gold, your cocoa, to your cotton, your white gold. There's a slump for raw materials that is impacting Africa in a very, very big way. Even the resilient metals like gold, nothing is happening. There's a slump as well. But even more importantly, in relation to the sector that has hosted this forum, the devastating impact on the travel and tourism sector, where virtually the African Airlines Association has reported a 95% grounding of our African airlines. You begin to see that the negative impact of coronavirus is exogenously driven. It's driven by external factors. But that notwithstanding, the impact of containment measures at home, referred to as lockdowns, has been a product of our own decisions. And it is that which actually informs the split results as posted by participants today, where it's almost 51-49% in terms of whether they are optimistic or non-optimistic that our economies will rapidly come back. It is a product of what people are understanding to be the impact of exogenous factors, as opposed to what would be a product of our own decisions as Africans, because we look to the outside. We don't look to the inside. If we were inward looking as a continent, industrialized and producing our own food, trading amongst ourselves, opening up to ourselves, the impact of the lockdowns would be less severe. This is not the first time that we are being affected by a virus. In 1968, 1969, the Hong Kong flu, it cleared almost 1 million people, 100,000 in the United States. There were no lockdowns then, and the response was not a lockdown of economies, but it was risk-adjusted responses that taught the world then, in the absence of social media and the ICT revolution that connects us now, to respond through risk-adjusted measures that taught the world then to live with the virus. And I think going forward into the future, we have to accept a new normal where we live with coronavirus and we keep our economies going. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. From what you have explained, I hear you say that one of the reasons that has made this an African problem is the fact that we are dependent. Africa is still very much dependent on external markets. And as a result, when there's a change in the external market, then it automatically comes and affects us here in Africa. Now, I'd be interested to know, Professor Lumumba, what are your views where this is concerned? I mean, for the longest time in Africa, we know we have everything. We've got the minerals, we've got the resources, we've got everything. Everything originates pretty much from Africa. But then we are still dependent, and problems that shouldn't be of African, problems that shouldn't necessarily be African problems end up being African problems. What are your views on this? Was this really our problem? And is there anything that we could have done differently?
Thank you very much. First, let me thank Walter, who in my view has pretty much summarized the issue as to whether this is our problem. And I can't agree with him more, that to the extent that we are part of the globe, we are part of the problem becomes our problem. And I also agree with him that when this particular virus was declared a pandemic, there was a sense in which we did not have time to coordinate, or even if we had, we did not coordinate. And we pretty much borrowed what was being done initially in Wuhan, then the United States of America, then Italy and Spain. and lockdown became the response as a one-size-fits-all response without assessment of the specificities of each country. And he has rightly said, we live in a continent where almost 80% of those who are earning income are in the informal sector. I know, of course, that there are few countries that did not go into the whole hog of the lockdown, like Tanzania and Burundi, but those are few and far between. The net effect, of course, is that our economies have been left devastated. Left devastated once again for the reasons that has been outlined. We have, in the recent past, killed many of our industries. Remember that intra-African trade stands at no more than 25%. And I think even in saying that, I'm a little generous. If you look at most of our industries that were thriving in the early years, if you go to Nigeria, for example, you look at the textile industry in Kaduna and the northern part of Nigeria, all that die. You come to East Africa and you look at the textile industries that thrived during the 1960s and 70s, all those died. If you come down to Zimbabwe, you will discover that the situation is the same. And I think that really exposed our underbelly in the area of agriculture. And I speak at a time now, for example, when Kenya is importing maize from Mexico, which is expected to arrive in the country in the next week. And that tells you how exposed we are. And if you go into the area of agriculture, which we have described as the backbone of our economies, you go into what I call vanity products, such as flowers. You discover that Europe is not importing as much flowers, cut flowers, as they did last year. And people have lost whole crops. And one can go on and on into the raw materials that we produce with reduced production. Nobody is buying the raw materials. And one therefore asks the question going forward, had we been a people who put premium on value addition and traded more within ourselves, perhaps the impact would not have been as devastating as it is. And it's not only in that area, even in the financial sector, given the character of our currencies. If you look at any currency in Africa today, whether you are talking about the Naira or the Rand or the Kwanza or the Medical or the shilling or the francs, the way they are behaving against the so-called hard currency, against specifically the dollar, against the euro, against the American, the Canadian dollar, against the British pound, tells you that we are going to be devastated. Remember that many of the loans that we have borrowed from the Bretton Woods institutions are dollar denominated. So even when we resume, it's going to be a very heavy burden on us. And this in itself ought to worry us, but yet there is a sense in which we must be a little bit more optimistic. And I think that Dr. MZEMBI has actually outlined what I consider to be the way to look forward. That perhaps if there is any positive thing that we have realized is that had we been more inward looking, we would have been spared the brunt. And luckily, the truth is that the strain of the virus that we have in Africa is not as virulent as we have seen in Europe and the United States of America, which then gives us an opportunity to guard ourselves against the possibility of another virus, which may be even more devastating. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying, we are now saddled with a problem. Whether it originated from the continent or not, it has devastated us. It is a problem that has exposed the underbelly of our economies in a manner never seen before in our lifetimes. It is also something that has exposed how weak our health systems are. Remember, we have had to rely on testing kits from the very same China. We have had to rely on masks from the very same China. We are now waiting for vaccines, possibly from the very same China and the United States of America. So even our pharmaceutical industries must now be a focus. And lastly, to allow others also to contribute. If we are going to industrialize, energy is going to become very important. The big players in the energy sector in Africa, such as ESCOM, which at one time was the 5th biggest utility provider in the world, is now in a crisis. So when we come back and we talk manufacturing, do we have the energy? The Grand Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo, are we going to go into manufacture? We have the energy. If you go to the Grand Renaissance Dam, and we know there is a battle and a conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt. So there are many things, and I conclude by saying, we are in a happy position, the problems notwithstanding. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to be operationalized from the month of July, hopefully. A Secretary General has already been appointed. And if you look at that against the 7 pillars of the Africa Agenda 2063, we have a unique opportunity to now begin to do things that will improve our economies, and I think it will happen. Sometimes it takes a crisis of this kind of proportion in order to catapult a society into an orbit of economic development. Let me rest my contribution there so that my other colleagues can also cross-pollinate our ideas.
Sorry, Professor, just permit me to interject, please, Doris. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries.
Professor, there's a question that has just emerged from one of our attendees, and I'd just like to please pose it to you respectfully. And they're asking, with trade affected globally, and Africa probably paying the highest price for it, could it be a wake-up call for Africa for stronger inter-country trade to survive such crises?
Danny, without doubt. I've just given a live example of Kenya importing maize from Mexico. Once again, our hard-earned currency is going to Mexico. And I want to believe that Kenya may not be the only country. There may be other countries that are also importing from Brazil. We are importing sugar, we are importing maize, we are importing rice. But you assume that Kenya was importing that from Tanzania or from Malawi, or that Nigeria and Ghana were importing rice, not from Pakistan, but from Kenya and from Cote d'Ivoire, and that Malawi was also not importing things from other. You can already begin to see that our currencies would be strengthened and jobs would be created. For the moment, as we continue to import from other parts of the world, jobs are created out there, and we remain who we have been for a very long time, producing what we do not consume and consuming what we do not produce, to our very detriment.
Thank you very much for your response, Professor Lumumba. I see that this question, as I had anticipated, would garner a lot of interest from the participants, and a lot of questions and comments are coming through. So we're going to try and address some of them. In the interest of time, we will not be able to address all of them. But I would like to throw this one at you, Professor Lumumba, or Walter, one of you, whoever one would like to answer this one. We have Ben Morunga, who has asked this question. I am trying to follow Dr. Walter and Dr. Lumumba. What kind of response should we, Africa, then have had instead of a lockdown? Who would like to take that? Walter, Professor Lumumba?
Walter, you can take it first because I've just had a bite, then I'll add something.
Well, we have some examples of countries that did not take up lockdowns in their absolute sense. One lauded example internationally is that of Taiwan. You can see that their deaths per million is actually 0.3%. If you take Ethiopia, Ethiopia is not on a total shutdown. In fact, it isn't really at all. Its deaths per million is 0.04%. If you take the example of Sweden in Europe, which is not on an absolute shutdown, its deaths per million is 347 per million. When you compare that to Belgium, which is on an absolute shutdown. Its deaths per million is 764 per million. Across the oceans to the United States, with its famous lockdowns, as we know them, its deaths per million is 274. And these statistics that I'm sharing are as per the 23rd of May. So it is almost like the experience that we had with HIV when people initially responded with stigmatization and eventually learned to live. And we popularized the phrase living with HIV. And today, you cannot imagine that there was once a disease that stigmatized people to the extent where even these quarantines were created for HIV. So we have to navigate through this because it will be with us. We are still suffering the impact of the 1918 influenza virus. It is still with us. The impact of the 1968-69 H2N3, the Hong Kong flu, is still with us. This is the nature of viruses. So we need to find a way of testing, isolating, treating as a solution. And that's what the world is now waking up to. If we don't do that, really, shutdown or lockdown economies have the potential of creating not just conflict, but revolutions. As you can see now, there's a debate that is pitting governments and bureaucracy on the one hand against business and labor and the proletariat on the other hand, because people cannot simply sustain, and our economies cannot sustain lockdowns ad infinitum. Just try and imagine if there's another wave of these deaths, whether the response would be lockdowns and how we can sustain them without the necessary social support, safety nets that should go with locking our informal communities. How do you enforce lockdowns in informal settlements for starters? So we have to find a way of responding to this coronavirus and start living again.
Thank you.
So I think with your response, Dr. Walter, maybe we should applaud the Tanzanian government because they did not impose the lockdown, and in fact they have announced that they are free to start business, to start everything. I guess they probably know something that the rest of Africa doesn't know.
The factor should be transparency.
Yeah.
We have to make sure that as we do it, we are also transparent with our returns, so that we don't underplay the impact. It must be known.
Wonderful.
If I may add something, just what Walter said, at the risk of people thinking we are being cynical, we are not. We hold the view, at least I hold the view, that this has to be taken seriously. But the evidence available now does suggest that the lockdowners have had more deaths per million than those who approached it differently. And he's already given the examples of Taiwan, Sweden, Japan, South Korea. What one is saying, therefore, is that in response as African countries, we ought to have had a situational analysis. One may say we had no time. We ought to have analyzed our specific situation and also responded in a coordinated manner regionally, so that within SADC, there is coordination, within ECOWAS, there is coordination, within Central Africa, there is coordination, and within East Africa, there is coordination, and in the Maghreb. And if we did that, it would have been a lot better than having these trucks being stopped at borders and undermining the economy and the supply chains to the detriment of the population. And now, just the last point, many governments now have no exit strategy. Because they have been following what is happening in Europe and America, they have no exit strategy. And you hear them say, now that the world is opening up, let us open up, without necessarily and objectively assessing their own situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree and concur with you. Now, we really do have to move on to our next question. But before I do that, there is a question that has been asked, and permit me to just use my discretion to ask it at this time, because it is important. It's for the interest of all our African brothers and sisters. And again, Professor Lumumba, this is directed to you. And it is from Jacob Mugini from Mara, Tanzania. And he says, hello, Professor Lumumba. There was no lockdown in Tanzania, and we thank God that the figures of coronavirus infections here are going down at an impressive rate. Airports are now open for tourists and our country's tourist destinations. So the question is, how can you describe the measures taken by the government of Tanzania to fight the pandemic? Now, I know you are a friend of the Tanzanians, so I can totally understand how Jacob is asking you. Can you respond? Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I will. The first thing that we must appreciate is that everybody throughout the world has been responding to Corona, sometimes by trial and error, if you may, and sometimes by learning on the go. And this must be informed by the realities of specific countries, which is the lesser of the two evils. And I think that even in Tanzania, when I heard the government said it is important to ensure that we sanitize the basic protocols, that we maintain physical distance, that we close schools, and that we ensure that all those prescriptions by the World Health Organization and by the African CDCs are observed. But when it comes to locking down, they posed the question, which they answered to themselves, that there is no hard evidence suggesting that when you lock down, then you are safer. And it appears that they are being proved wrong. And the Swedes actually came up, and Dr. Walter may know this better than I, they had infection, that the more you have it within the population, the less virulent it is. And therefore, wisdom demands, as was done in Taiwan, as was done in South Korea, as was done in a number of countries, you isolate those who are positive and deal with them specifically. But when you go into what you call mass assumption that everybody is affected and therefore you lock them down, particularly in the informal settlements that we have in many places in Africa, then you are, in a manner of speaking, riding the wrong horse. And ultimately you can't get the decision that you want. And that is why I'm very happy that, in fact, it is now emerging that the Swedes, the Tanzanians, the Burundians, the Taiwanese may have responded much better. Not that anybody knew. So it's not about apportioning blame, but it appears that it was a more realistic approach rather than saying anybody was wrong or right.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your response, Professor Lumumba. Honestly, there are so many questions coming in, but I would like now to go ahead and go to the second question, and hopefully for all those who have put your questions on the Q&A box, we will find time to come back to them. Thank you very much. Now, the rest of the world, if you've been following the news, if any of you, and indeed many of us have been following the news, following social media, there have been prophets of doom, citing statements alluding to the fact that Africa is unlikely to recover anytime soon after COVID-19. Now, I know such statements have raised some concern within Africans, even up to anger, that how could they say this about our continent? Now, what I would like to ask you, Cuthbert, do you agree with this statement? The naysayers who are saying that Africa is never going to recover from COVID-19 anytime soon. What do you think about that?
Thank you so much, Chair. Yes, you are right that the world has been casting their lots as prophets of doom, especially towards Africa. If they were really prophets, surely they would have foreseen this pandemic that has caused so much pain and destruction before reaching their shores. So therefore, I wouldn't really give much notice to their doomed prophetical sides. But my plea is for Africa to wake up now and smell the coffee, so to speak. This pandemic should resonate our resilience and have a well-coordinated recovery plan that will prioritize and talk to us as Africa. I allude with Prof and Doc that we need to start to look within it is so sad that we are dictated by exterior forces and whose objectives, of course, are centered on their personal gains. So these are the forces who have not the slightest interest on the developments and progress of our nations. Therefore, we need to resonate our own true prophets whose genes are embedded in our motherland. All 54 states, member states, we have managed to break the chains of political slavery from our oppressors. But we are failing, and we have failed to break the chains that have enslaved all of us, the chains of economic dependency and slavery. So therefore, I have always wondered why always we worship the so-called rating agencies who control and determine our financial economies. These are the blocks who are actually headquartered in New York and London. We have surrendered our economic power to these folks. So we have become they have then become our decision makers and economic gatekeepers. So this has to come to a change. So that's my appeal and advocacy. And now is the time Africa is able to deal and monitor its own affairs. Let us therefore stand together. And by the way, with the invention of technology, we have managed to bridge the divide that spans the space between each member state and the continent at large. We have even managed to enhance travel between distances, and through communication, we have managed to speak one language and transact business far and wide. Yet, so said, all this has done enough to destroy the walls that stand between 54 countries. We need to stand together as a block of nations. And I believe that pandemic should actually play a pivotal role in then setting a pace for Africa to now demonstrate its resilience and its power to stand together and isolate ourselves so that we can deal with the issues with the best interest of our citizens, best interest of our beloved motherland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cuthbert. Danny, you have a question? Do you want to share with us? Go ahead, Danny.
Yes, thank you, Doris. This question, I think, will be directed at Cuthbert. It is said that Africa is home to an estimated 1/3, possibly, of the world's mineral reserves. What is it that makes Africa probably the richest continent, and yet still the continent that has the poorest people? And what should Africa be doing differently to change that scenario?
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Look, we imagine more than half member states. I would concur with the colleague who asked the question. We are top scorers when it comes to natural abundance of our resources. We need a synchronized commitment from all of us. We need to quarantine ourselves as a continent and start looking within our own powerhouse. We need to quarantine ourselves from the Asians, from the Europeans, from our former colonies. So Africa has a potential and importance to economic development. We need to structure and develop our own policies. It's unfortunate that we have inherited policies that have actually been brought to us by our oppressors. So now is the time where we need to stand together and formulate our own strategies that will then capitalize our respected regional assets, zoomed together, that then will underscore the prioritization of our economy as Africans in Africa.
Thank you very much, Cuthbert. Now, from what I hear you say, that, you know, we do have a lot going on for us in Africa, yet the narration still remains the same, that Africa isn't really ever going to amount to anything. Now, could it be because we are very good at talking, but not that great at actually doing what it is we said we're going to do. And this is in reference to a question that I saw somewhere up here, which says, well, okay, I can't find it. There's so many questions right now, but someone did ask that, isn't it time for Africa and African leaders to stop talking and start doing? Isn't it time for action? And to that, I would like to direct to you, Professor Lumumba. What do you think about that? We do talk a lot, we document things fantastically, but when it comes to implementation, nothing ever happens. Now, if we're ever going to talk about recovery, you know, getting to a point where we do and start acting is really, really important. What are your views on that, Professor Lumumba?
Said, but the nature of things is that it is the bad news that is news. But there are good things happening in Africa if you look keenly. Right. And the good things are informed by the realization that we have made a number of mistakes. If you look at the 7 pillars of the Africa Agenda 2063 and the desire to make Africa grow economically using our resources, human and natural, you can already begin to see a number of countries doing very useful things. If you look at what is happening in Ethiopia now, within a very short time, the power generation, if the Grand Renaissance Dam is completed, it will be generating 10,000 megawatts of electricity. You now can begin talking about industrialization. And if you look at the regional efforts, and I'll give the example, of course, there are hiccups in the region in terms of removing tariff and non-tariff barriers. But if you follow, whether it's the East African Community or SADC or ECOWAS, you can see that in critical areas, for example, in the area of agriculture, there is the desire and even the plan of even countries which are dependent on oil, like Angola, like Ghana, like Nigeria, to begin to look towards agriculture. And I think that those are good signs. I will agree with you now that there is a sense in which we have made too many agreements, from Cotonou to Lomé to Lagos Plan of Action. But the ultimate now, as I see it, is the African Continental Free Trade Area. And you will know that when Africa Continental Free Trade Area started the negotiation, they say Africans can't do it. It took Africans 4 years what it took Europeans 40 years. They say it will not be signed. 54 countries have signed. They say it won't be ratified. 28 have ratified. They said it won't start. It is starting in July. So that when you collapse all these tariff and tariff barriers, I think, and this is the last point I'm making in response to this, that COVID-19 has done something that nothing else has ever done. One, even Africans in the diaspora, who are nearly 200 million, are now in very practical terms saying, how can we go back home and be part of the process of the revival of the continent? The people at home are also beginning to do that. I see African millionaires. I've just seen Tony Elumelu from Nigeria, Aliko Dangote, Patrice Motsepe, and David Shriav Maziwa. People are beginning to think and to implement. So we have lamented, and I think sometimes we are our own worst enemies. We judge ourselves too harshly. And because we do that, we are not able to recognize the good things that we are doing. Look at what happened in Malagasy, which I can't tire talking about. The Malagasy Institute of Applied Technology came up with something. Some prefer to dismiss it as a concoction, but the fact that they did it is something to be commended. Perhaps that is what we needed to unlock our pharmaceutical potential. Right now, in the area of minerals, we see that Rwanda and Tanzania are now beginning to participate in the gold market. And we see Botswana is now cutting diamond. And when you look at what has happened in Senegal at the Louis Pasteur Center in making fast testing equipment for COVID-19, a lot of things are happening which suggest to me that we are learning something, and that when we go back to the new normal, the political leadership will now recognize that, number one, there must be a connectivity between politics, business, academia, and that research and development must be given its pride of place. And we should de-emphasize areas that don't put food on the table, and we should mechanize agriculture and be able to feed our people. Good things are happening, not as fast as we would want them, but remember that this is an intergenerational struggle, which requires co-generational leadership.
Thank you very much, Professor. We hear you and we hear you well. For all of those who are listening, it takes a while, but we are absolutely on the road to that recovery. Danny, you have a question? Please share it with us right now. And is it from the Q&A?
Yes, yes, it's on Q&A. Let me just access it. Just give me a second, please. This question is from Christopher Phillips, and I think it should be directed to CUTHBERT. I think it's right up his alley. And Christopher is asking, can we leave here today with the knowledge that there is a central hub where we can contribute to assist in effective Africa tourism recovery plans?
I think that's a topic in itself.
I like the reaction.
That is a topic in itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a topic itself. Look, it's good that we are now setting up the pace, especially the platform of engagement as a collective force. That how then from here, where do we then go? So I'm sure by the end of our discussions, definitely we might come up with the light at the end of the tunnel on how then do we progress from where we are.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, Doris, if you just permit me, I'd just like to throw in one more question before you proceed. Sorry, Doris. Let me just allow me to interject. There's an interesting question that has come up. Let me just access it on the Q&A. Just a second.
And Danny,
okay,
sorry, Danny, as you find the question, I'd just like to note that Professor Lumumba has to leave us now. He only has a few more minutes.
I'll stay on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Professor had said he'd stay on.
Oh, fantastic.
Go ahead, Danny.
That's fantastic. I'll actually direct this question to the good professor. Professor, the question reads as follows. I believe that the core problem of Africa is leadership. How do we educate Africans to vet their politicians, to focus on their people and Africa? And how do we leave this club of old leaders? I'm not sure what the club of old leaders is, but you might have a better understanding of that than I have.
That to me is a very interesting question. All of us have argued, and with some merit, that political leadership defines many things. And we have seen that in a few countries where the political leadership has been right, the economy has benefited. And I'll give a few examples, though sometimes I'm accused of supporting dictators. I don't think they are. But you've seen in countries such as Rwanda, for example, post-genocide Rwanda, whether you like Paul Kagame or not, you can see what focused leadership can do within a short time. It impacts in research and development, it impacts in health, it impacts in agriculture. We have also seen that in Ethiopia within the short period that Prime Minister Abiy has been there. And even in Uganda, after the departure of Idi Amin in 1986, that Uganda was restored. We have seen that in Botswana, we have seen that in Namibia, we have seen that in Tanzania. So I can't agree with you more that political leadership is at the very heart of energizing development at all levels, socio-economic and otherwise. But if there is one thing, perhaps I'm thinking that COVID is too nice in terms of jolting us into action. But for the first time in the history of Africa, there is not a single African leader that is outside of the continent. They're all here. There is not a single minister that is outside of the continent, which tells them that going forward, you've got to make your own environment livable. The population is now also seeing the quality of leadership in the manner in which the leadership has responded. So I think that a number of things are going to change. And Dr. Walter actually alluded to it. that if we don't get it right, there will be revolutions. People will be thrown out of office because they can't deliver on the economic question. Because people want to have homes, people want housing, people want food, people want to live in clean environment, and they are only going to respect the political class who have been given the honor and privilege to serve, who are going to midwife that. The problem is also partly our own electorates. African electorates are susceptible to manipulation through ethnicity and clanism. But now we know better that when COVID comes, even when your kinsman is the president, it doesn't spare you. And I think those realities are going to dawn on us. And I think that we too, particularly we who have had the advantage of exposure, our voices must be heard a lot more clearly, a lot more consistently, so that we call political leadership to answer and to do the right thing.
Thank you very much, Professor Lumumba. Now, so that we can move away, we have a lot of interest, particularly from a government perspective, and I can tell you the questions that are coming in, we will need the whole day to address all of these questions, but we'll try our best to pick, some of them. And to all of you who are sending in your questions, thank you so very much. Just keep them coming in. We will probably have another platform where we can be more focused on the issues that are arising. But now, CAREL, I'd like to turn to you, because as we know, the other speakers are more focused from a government and political perspective. You, on the other hand, you are an entrepreneur. Please unmute yourself before you speak. You're an entrepreneur. You're doing great things in South Africa, and you are the voice of SMMEs. CAREL, as we talk about economic recovery, SMMEs are arguably the catalyst to economic growth and development. Now, given that most will have suffered immensely, financial blows, loss of revenues, business shutdowns, what advice can you give SMMEs that will help them to survive and have a business to return to after all this is over? And I'm sure you've also picked up a lot of points from the speakers that spoke before you. What can you say to the SMMEs who have tuned in right now? What do they need to do in order to start recovering?
Thank you very much. First and foremost, the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted the small, medium, and micro-sized enterprises all over the world, especially Africa. Yeah. It has created a great deal of uncertainty and nightmare for everyone. Already the clean environment was suppressed by many issues prior to the pandemic, to name but a few: red tape, limited access to funding, particularly commercial funding, and entrance to the market. There are multiple intervention mechanisms that can assist us to alleviate the economic impact of COVID-19 on small businesses, primarily through government's relief finance schemes and debt restructuring facilities. Countries must take an immediate policy response to deliberately support the continuity and sustainability of small, medium, and micro-sized enterprises. More importantly, to jumpstart them back into the mainstream economy post the pandemic. Secondly, we need to adapt to the new normal and be able to define the future. As Africans, as entrepreneurs and business owners, we should always be on the edge of the next creative wave. Everyone has to focus on what exactly is their value add. Those who can create value through leadership, relationships, and creativity will be able to remain relevant and transform their industries post the pandemic. We are always at our best when we are being challenged. So it is very important that everyone should take this time to envision ways to expand and build successful multinational companies. Africa has a lucrative market and multiplicity of opportunities. The playing field has been leveled for the active participation of the previously disadvantaged individuals and nations. Let's take a closer look at the current multinational corporations operating within our African landscape. most have neglected the developmental role of businesses, especially small, medium, micro-sized enterprises, through their CSIs programs, meaning we cannot have a comprehensive, frank and forthright discussion regarding the rapid economic recovery response without looking at the fundamental alteration of the capitalist systems that hampers the indigenous people's participation within the tremendous opportunities accessible in the continent. We are fully cognizant of the fact that some of these multinational corporations are the ultimate beneficiaries of our economic policies. Nonetheless, that should not deter our primary objectives. Post the COVID-19 pandemic, we should think of collaborating and taking advantage of the vast opportunities in our continent. This pandemic has made me realize that the world is shrinking. It is no longer as big as we had thought. Globalization is transpiring right before our eyes. Critical questions to perhaps consider and ask ourselves going forward is, how will this affect our day-to-day conventional way of doing business? As a result, every person must now and can ask, where do I, an individual, fit into the global competition and opportunities of the day? How can I, on my own, collaborate with others globally? So we are in the middle of a big technological change. The initial globalization in the early 1400s was established on primary purpose of countries trade with other countries. The second globalization revised from countries trading with countries to businesses trading with businesses in the early 18 to 1900. Presently, currently, we entered the third and the fourth globalization, which is characterized by individuals trading amongst each other and being value-add products and services to maximize profit for their companies. Furthermore, technology affords us an opening to trade with anyone across Africa and still receive innovative and exceptional services and goods. We cannot afford to get caught in the past and resist change. Let me paraphrase. Number one, let us explore government funding schemes in our respective countries. Number two, let's reinvent our current trade and enhance your value add to remain competitive. Build an alternative competitive market. Look for opportunities. Third, look for opportunities to collaborate with others globally, taking advantage of the opportunities technology is bringing. Don't be limited by the borders of your country. The playing field has been leveled for us.
Thank you very much, CAREL.
Thank you so much.
I believe thank you so much. That was so insightful. Danny, I believe you have a follow-up for CAREL. There's a lot of comments coming through.
Yes.
We literally have to sift through them.
There's so many comments, it's hard to keep up. But I'd just like to throw this at you, CAREL. First of all, thank you for those very, very key insights. But and I'd like to request to answer this one in 1 minute or less, because I'm speaking from a point of view of, I'm an African SMME. So in the simplest possible language that I can understand, and that will help me going forward. We all understand the importance of political will and having the right policies in place and creating the conducive environment for SMMEs to grow. But what do I, as an SMME and African SMME, what do I need to do, or where do I need to be specifically to get out of this thing in terms of growth? In 1 minute or less.
Look, I think what is very important for us is that going forward, we need to explore ways to do business outside the borders of our countries. Collaboration is a cornerstone for us to forge and to build united business fronts. So what is important for us is that let us look at the trade opportunities outside our countries so that we can enhance and grow our businesses.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Danny, you've been communicating with me about a question from Ambassador Mulamula. Do you think we can address that now? Because I've seen at least 3 questions that alluding to the same situation. And this question can be, anybody on the panel can respond to. Danny, go ahead and let's ask this question. It is from?
access. I'm just trying to access Ambassador Mulamula's question. Just give me a second.
It is somewhere towards the bottom. Ish.
Yeah, I've got it.
Okay.
I've got it. Okay, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula. Oh gosh, I've lost it again.
So many questions.
There's so many questions. Every time I access it, another one just overtakes it.
Yeah, where is it now? I don't see it anymore.
I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, Ambassador Liberata, we're trying to find your question. It was very, but just to part, do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it was, okay, I've got it. Here it says, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula from Tanzania, and welcome, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to have you on board. I asked the following question. What is the place of women in this discussion in terms of response and recovery, as well as inclusiveness and people-centered approach in terms of leaving no one behind? I think I would like to direct this one at Dr. Walter MZEMBI.
Please unmute yourself, Walter. There you go.
Women
That
have been most impacted. Women constitute the bulk of our informal traders. If we are talking about locking out people or locking them down, I think women have been affected the most. So in bringing back African economies, I think we now need to reassert ourselves and recommit to African aspirations, goals and priorities, which are very sound on paper, on gender and women and the youth. We have been celebrating gender years, we've been celebrating years of the youth, but I think the answer is in implementing. The answer is in implementation. And we have a number of flagship projects that we must bring to the fore in Africa, starting, of course, on the very first one, the formulation of an African commodities strategy. This one is outstanding. Women trade in commodities. They move a lot of our commodities across borders. But do we as governments have a commitment to facilitate cross-border trade? Because what I saw as the first reaction of quarantines and isolations and lockdowns in the main affected women who were pushed out of their usual business of cross-border trade. I saw a very, very grim picture or video this morning of women trading between South Africa and Zimbabwe across the Limpopo because the borders are closed. What governments classify as commodity trading is that which is moved by huge trucks that they have designated for the trade or for the purpose. They forget the women, our women who are largely the cross-border traders because they've been stigmatized by these terms that we allude to them as cross-border traders, when they're actually, in the first instance, women in tourism and women in business. So it starts with rebranding their activities and destigmatizing what they do, because what they do is essentially what runs African economies in the main, the cross-border trading that they're doing. But we've stigmatized it by the terms that we append to what they do on a daily basis. So I would start with that. Now, the commitment by Africa on a single African passport and movement of people has been reversed because COVID tested the solidarity of Africans. And in an instant, that virus reversed the gains of the free movement of people. That free movement of people is characterized by the cross-border movement of women from one country and another, moving goods and services. So it is really in the ambit of government, in the real arm of government, what it will do to facilitate the work of women, of our women.
Thank you very much, Walter. Professor Lumumba, I would really like to hear your views on this. What role do you see women playing in the rapid recovery for Africa? Would like to hear your views, please, if you would.
Thank you. First of all, I think there are certain fundamentals that we must recognize, and I think Dr. Walter has mentioned a number of them. If you look at the African rural economies, which is actually the backbone of African economies, is women who support those economies. Unfortunately, at the policy formulation level, women are not properly represented. The net effect is that the gains that can be achieved by involving women a lot more intimately are not realized because of this. But the beauty, before I come to the crux of the matter, is that we have recognized this. If you look at pillar number 6 of the Africa Agenda 2063, it says, among other things, that going forward, you are going to develop Africa by involving women and the youth. And that pillar is also supported by SDG goal number 5, which recognizes that you cannot have more than 50% of your population outside of the policy-making arena. So what I would myself love to see going forward, knowing as we do that women are represented at the lower ranks, I would want to see women involved at policy formulation level. That will mean that women are in the legislative arms of government. And in this regard, I salute Rwanda, which is the leading in the world in this regard. And when you look at Rwanda, which I use as an example, the fact that women are present at all critical levels, and you now go into the indices of human development, you can see that the question of poverty in the household and hunger is reducing by the day because women are involved in creating gender-sensitive interventions in this regard. So I don't want to overemphasize the issue because it is already recognized. Sometimes we pay lip service to it. But I think the time is now that we must go beyond paying lip service, and we want to see very practical interventions, and women are mainstreamed in the scheme of things. If Africa is to realize our potential, and realize our potential, she will.
Danny, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Professor. I have a follow-up question from Moshood Adewale in Nigeria, and it's related to what you just answered, Professor, so I'll please direct this one at you as well. And Moshood is saying that he believes that doing intra-African trade will help a great deal in this pandemic period. His question is, what are African leaders doing, or what should they be doing to improve intra-African trade in that respect?
You know, I think that I can't agree with him more. Everybody now recognizes that that is true. And I'll give a number of live examples. He remembers very well being from Nigeria, the spat that there was between Nigeria and Ghana in the SMME border. And that only, if you looked at its impact on trade during that very short period, and the matter has not been resolved completely, and you come to East Africa and you look at the border spat initially between Rwanda and Uganda, and recently between Kenya and Tanzania, and right now the holdback between Kenya and Uganda. And you go down south, what is happening in the Limpopo that the good doctor has already spoken about, and the spat between Zambia and Tanzania. If it were to be reduced to shillings and cents or nairas or cedis, it will be in the billions. The reason why Europe thrives, even as we speak now, is because European trade is 68%. Europeans trading amongst themselves. We are doing no more than 20%. The Americas are possibly doing anything between 60 and 70%. Asia is at 50%. And when that begins to happen, and I talked about maize importation, for example, the billions that Kenya is now spending to import maize from Mexico would have been paid to Malawi or Zambia. The billions that Nigeria and Ghana are spending to import rice from Pakistan would have been paid to Cote d'Ivoire or to Kenya. And I think, therefore, that going forward, and I hope that immediately we begin to embrace normalcy, there will be emergency meetings to address the economy. They must start regionally. That SADC must look at the economic recovery program going forward. Then East African Community does so, ECOWAS does so, Central Africa does so, Maghreb does so, and then all that will come to the African Union to give a new impetus to Africa Continental Free Trade Area so that we eliminate these trade, tariff and non-tariff barriers. Because sometimes we remove the tariff barriers, and yet, as Walter said, you are confronted with a situation on Limpopo, which is non-tariff. How do you deal with that? And these are the things that I think if we address them, and I hope that the ACTFA will begin to operate in the month of July so that we can begin to bring down some of these hurdles that are undermining us. And lastly, I think when we begin to trade, you will discover that innovation will come in, invention will come in. Uganda, for example, now have a solar-powered bus. Suppose we took the view as Africans that we are going to invest in production of that bus commercially. We would immediately stop importing Volvo buses. And you can imagine what that would do to the motor vehicle industry. What that would do if we agreed that we are going to deal with fossil fuel within Africa. Nigeria would not be exporting oil to Europe and America in the first place. It would be consumed here. So one cannot argue with what is said, that intra-African trade and free movement of goods and services and peoples is going to be the game changer going forward.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very in-depth and insightful comments. And with that, CAREL, I think I'd like to direct this next question to you, because Professor has spoken about intra-African trade. You also mentioned that it is time for SMMEs to start considering trading across borders, to stop thinking within the borders that they are within and start being bold enough to venture across the, across the nations from which they're in. Do you think SMMEs have that? And what do you think SMMEs need in order to really have that boldness? Because most of the times SMMEs have that mindset that, you know what, I can't, I won't, I am not going to be able, I need support from the bank won't give you support. So how are they actually going to move across and start trading outside of their own borders, given that there are all those limitations?
Yeah, I think what is imperative is that for SMMEs to succeed, we need the assistance of government.
Yeah.
We need the government to put together policy frameworks that will be conducive for entrepreneurs to do business outside the borders of their own countries. I think one of the greatest challenges that small, medium, micro-sized enterprises have been facing, even prior to the pandemic challenge, is that they lack access to funding. I think what is quite important now is that SMMEs should then come together and find ways to create some sort of cooperative funding or mutual funding investment accounts where they can all save money and develop constitutions that can govern those cooperative banks. And what is also important is that SMMEs must get involved in the mainstream economic businesses. They should not hold back and think the mainstream economic businesses is only for multinational companies. They should create those companies themselves, and they should create those products that are in need in the market. So I think the great issue is not necessarily that entrepreneurs can't find opportunities. The greatest issue is that the current policy frameworks does not allow them to actively participate in the economy.
Yeah.
So the current policy frameworks, like I said previously, it favors the multinational companies than the locals that we have in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Guys, we really have The questions are absolutely overwhelming, but I would like us now to direct this conversation to a topic that is really pertinent to Africa in general, and that is one of tourism. There have been a lot of comments from our participants touching on tourism. We have some questions as well around tourism. And why do I say that the tourism question is important? Because most, if not all, of the African nations solely or largely depend on tourism for their economic growth. So, Cuthbert, I have this question for you. Tourism being a vital source of income for most, if not all, African countries, we have seen that tourism has come to a grinding halt. Literally, everything has been cut off. And all of this is as a result of the worldwide bans on travel. So now, can Africa truly bounce back and recover its tourism sector independently? Or are we again doomed to be dependent on what the rest of the world is doing? What are your views on that, Cuthbert?
Thank you. Thank you so much once again, Chair. To maximize our future gains as a continent, we need to improve our competitiveness. We have an enormous opportunity to take advantage of the abundance of our natural resources, and we need to build our own competitiveness by better utilizing Africa's natural resources as to generate nature-based tourism. As I have indicated from the offset, that half of our member states are top scorers when it comes to natural abundance of resources. We need a well-synchronized commitment from all of us. So therefore, Africa has a potential and the importance to economic development and recovery. So what we need to address the price competitiveness. We have excluded our domestic market segment. What is the way forward then? Having been imprisoned by legislations that were crafted by our colonizers in favor of their own interests. Hence, it is still not expensive, but very expensive to travel within one member state to another within a 1,000 kilometer radius. Yeah. It is more expensive to fly within as opposed to flying to Europe and the United States. That should be our focal point of departure. I stayed at a 3-star Southern Sun hotel in Dar es Salaam in February this year, where I paid double the rate that I paid in London during the World Tourism Market. I mean, there is something very wrong, and Africa must wake up. The high ticket taxis and airport charges are making our travel within and hotel prices more expensive. These challenges, they surely contribute to our continent less likely to attract our own domestic market and our own travel and tourism investors, despite its appealing natural asset. Therefore, the advocacy now is to reinforce our experiences and develop our tourism sector with a more integrated and holistic approach from all member states. We need a cross cooperation in all government agencies, in all public-private partnerships. It must start from national, regional, and continental level. With all its multi-tourism value chain, we need a paradigm shift of mentality from each head of states, from each policymaker and tourism stakeholders for policy reforms. We need policy reforms, structure reforms that will then boost our infrastructure reforms and thereby stimulating Africa's economic development. We have closed ourselves for too long, driven by the spirit of egotism that has cemented our segmentation as Africans. So I believe that now more than ever, we need a broader multi-stakeholder approach as we gear ourselves for a gradual economic recovery, which serves as the baseline to our tourism rebound. Time for Africa Union to start accelerating their united endeavors. I know Prof has quoted some of the laws that have been implemented, but We need a realistic approach and place our citizens in our continent as a priority agenda. We need to see a robust shift and a united implementation. In closing, Chair, we need leaders more than ever who will reflect the needs and realities of our mother Africa. And this is the right time as we rise from the shackles of the pandemic and put our resolves together. I am convinced that travel and tourism will remain as one of the key factors in growth within the Africa's economies, with its contribution, of course, of 8.5% of our gross domestic product. That, by the way, must be motivated by political stability in most member states and economic and accelerated by the development and implementation of policies. We need to craft policies that talks to us. That being said, we need a total postulate shift from international arrival dependence syndrome. By the way, the international market should actually come as a complement to our baseline towards our GDP. A total continental domestic approach. This should be our emphasis now more than ever. The reality, it will take time for the international community to completely open their borders to Africa. So the free trade zone in Africa was meant to free the continent from the dominance and slavery. We still need to see the total implementation thereof, with a combined gross domestic product from 54 member states surpassing the $3 trillion into a single market. The motherland has more than enough natural resources for our time and the times ahead. This pandemic should be a ticket for us to break free from the culture of colonial seclusions and embrace the culture of free and civilized world. We have all the rights to take care of our own resources as they belong to us and our progeny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cuthbert. And you've raised some very pertinent points there. And as a result of the points that you've raised, I really have to take probably one last question as we prepare to wrap up this session. It's been very interesting. It's been very engaging, but our time is swiftly getting ahead of us. And this question, Walter, I'd like to address it to you, Walter, or to Professor Lumumba or CAREL. Any one of you who feel you have some thoughts on this, please feel free to answer this question. It is from Oluyinka Oyeniji from Nigeria, and he says, I have found that some African entities make financial awards to support tourism in Africa. I am an investor, and I believe that the tourism industry in Africa stands at a vantage point to reap positive rewards as a result of the pandemic. Many tourism destinations in Nigeria and other parts of Africa have become abandoned. This is what Oluyinka is saying, that tourism destinations in Nigeria and other parts of Africa have become abandoned. I don't know how true this statement is. And then he goes on to say, is there any position or plan by the regional authorities to fund, the tourism stakeholders to help them really revive this economy? Do you know of any plans? Because governments, there's been a lot of funding or recovery schemes that are directed to other industries, but have there been any recovery schemes in the different parts of your countries that have been directed to the tourism industry?
Well, let me start by walking you through the genealogy of this sector. In 1950, there were 25 million arrivals, 25 million tourists recorded. By 2017, there were 1.2 billion arrivals in the world. I'm told after we left the sector, they were sitting just pre-COVID at about 1.8 billion arrivals, generating 1.8 trillion United States dollars in direct exports. representing 30% of global exports and placing tourism in the #3 position in terms of global export earnings after automobiles and chemicals. Now, the tragedy is this economic pillar is not well understood in Africa. And therefore, you will find that even at the African Union, it has no structure. It is embedded and buried under some commission as a desk. And as a result, Africa's market share of this pillar in both revenue and arrivals is in the range between 3 to 5%. So heads of states and African governments do not quite see the importance of this sector because they don't understand the value chain of this sector and how money is generated. Now, it is because of that matching and accompanying support for the sector is found missing. The mischief is in the structure starting right at the African Union. Only recently did African economies start really dedicating standalone ministries to administer this sector. And you see those that have done that, like South Africa, are doing very well, 10 million arrivals, those arrivals in their economies. There is no deliberate funding that has been placed for African tourism because we simply don't understand the sector. But going forward, here is the opportunity. Because of what we have already established in this discussion, that Africa was spared the brand of COVID. It means that Africa is a safe destination, and Africa is a resilient zone almost in its totality, minus the hotspots that we already know that have been heavily impacted.
Right.
So on the back of designated UNESCO heritage sites, we can carve out new coronavirus resilient products that can begin to attract not just the domestic market, but international arrivals. On the back of our natural social distancing products, like our national parks, our transfrontier conservation parks, we can actually provide a sanctuary. Even for international market, it can come back almost immediately because those people are in a post-traumatic stage where they are looking for sanctuaries to come and recover. So I will give you a destination as a case in point. If you take the Victoria Falls, for example, it's a transfrontier conservation destination that can easily be designated and packaged as a coronavirus resilient zone, but it's transfrontier to the extent that 5 countries have a confluence around the Victoria Falls that include Namibia, Botswana, Angola, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And we can reposition these natural social distance products with the attendant protocols to bring back our tourism almost immediately. But what do we need to do as governments? First, we need to make sure that our commitment to the African passport and an African Union visa is walked by all governments. We need to open up Africa, first to ourselves for domestic tourism, then to regional tourism, and ultimately to international tourism. We need to make sure that our single African transport market and what we refer to as the Yamoussoukro Declaration that connects Africa happens yesterday. Up to the time that COVID started, I think there were only 15 signatories to the Yamoussoukro Declaration, which opens up African airspace to African airlines and African economies. That needs to happen in earnest if we are going to recover this sector. But more importantly, we need to understand that in the rebranding of Africa going forward, the tourism pillar is not going to be the tail, it is actually the head. Opening up in itself is an indicator that a destination is opening for business. You can't say South Africa is open for business when the borders are closed or when the ports of entries are closed. You need to open them up. And the flying in of airlines into a destination in themselves will become a signal and a symbol of destination endorsement. So it's time to open up, first starting, and rightfully so, as Cuthbert mentioned, starting off with domestic tourism. Because you cannot open up a destination to international traffic when your own people are not enjoying it. And how do we do it? Government must take the lead. We are back in the days of Keynesian economics, where governments have started investing in public goods. So they are investing in health, they're investing in transport, they are investing in education. In doing so, they are making destinations attractive. But we must open up. There's no science to tourism except opening up destinations. Starting domestic, going forward to regional, integrated, transfer their products to international. So the answer to the Nigerian questioner is that it will come within the context of policy reviews that must understand the significance of this pillar.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Walter. And I think the tourism topic alone, it just deserves its own webinar, and perhaps we will see if we can make one of our next sessions dedicated to just tourism. And I think we have a question. Danny, you have a final question before we go to the wrap-up session? I know we've got so many questions, and I must apologize to all of you who have sent your questions. In the interest of time, we simply cannot address all the questions, but we do have one final question before we go to the wrap-up, and we talk about what is next. Danny?
Yes, I'd like to direct this question to Professor Lumumba. Still staying with the sector of tourism. In Tanzania, for instance, in 2019, Tanzania had an estimated 1.5 million tourists, which for us was a big threshold. But juxtapose that with a country like France, for instance. France in 2019, if I remember correctly, was pushing something like 89 point something million, 90 million. Tanzania has a lot to offer in terms of tourist attractions, a lot, probably more than France does. The question is, what do African governments and African countries need to do differently to tap into the potentiality that they're sitting? Because it's huge.
Thank you very much. Let me just, first of all, let me say how happy I am at what Walter has done and CUTHBERT in trying to tell us what is available. Look at the contribution of tourism to African economies, anything between 5 to 8%, about 200 billion United States dollars. But what products have we been selling over the years? If you go to Tanzania or Kenya or Rwanda or Burundi or Uganda, we have a single product. It's the big five. You go to the Serengeti and watch the animals, you watch the wildebeest. I think time has come that we must have other products. You go to places like Italy, you've talked about France. How many people visit the Eiffel Tower? I've just been, I was looking at the number of visitors that Africa had about 2 years ago. Africa received about 62 million tourists. And Turkey alone, which is a small country, received 52 million. And yet, as you've rightly said, we have better products. And my view, therefore, is that we've got to ask ourselves what products are available for us. And if you look at any region, if you look, Olayinka has talked about West Africa. If there was a coordinated approach within the West African region, there will be products including cultural tourism, including national parks, and a myriad of other things. You go to Namibia, the desert is an attraction. You go to South Africa, there'll always be something unique. So in a nutshell, my view is, number one, that Africans should identify the products that are available beyond the national, the traditional products. Once we have identified those products, this sibling rivalry where Ugandans and Kenyans want to attract tourists to the exclusion of others is in my view, not necessary. If we coordinated and had a single circuit, you'd be amazed that you'd remove from Serengeti and go to Lalibela to look at the famous churches in Lalibela in Ethiopia. So if you looked at it in that way, then I think there is a sense in which we will not be celebrating 1.5 million or 1 million. We will be receiving visitors in the tens of millions, and this can be achieved. And I think in saying that we need a coordinated policy approach, it is very important that we do so. And in terms of funding, for example, in Kenya, I know there is the Tourism Development Fund. I think Tanzania has, I think Uganda has, and perhaps now some of the regional banks should also identify tourism as being critical in the revival of the economy. Because when you talk about tourism, you are talking about the hospitality industry, which is now half dead in most countries. You are talking about the aviation industry. And when you talk about all these industries, the impact on agriculture, the hotels that ordered eggs, that ordered fish, that ordered meat are affected. So a coordinated approach which involves the regions, SADC doing its thing, ECOWAS doing its things, East Africa doing its thing. And I conclude by saying that the fact that this year is a year of silencing the guns in Africa is also very important. Because if you don't have peace and security in northern Nigeria, for example, I will not enjoy the sites that are to be found in Maiduguri or in Anambra or in Mali or in Mauritania. So creating peace and security, or rather giving a premium to peace and security as necessary for creating a facilitating environment is very critical. And he talks about the Mosi-Otunya Falls. I personally prefer that it should be called Mosi-Otunya, not Victoria. The Mosi-Otunya Falls is a unique thing. And therefore, in conclusion, I'm saying, let us have clear regional policies. Let us have implementation processes that cover the entire region. Let us address the question of movement of people, and also let us make that the dollars made in the tourism industry comes to Africa. You'll be shocked. You book a hotel in Zanzibar, but half of the money remains in Italy. You book a hotel in Zimbabwe, and half of the money remains in France. We must bring all those dollars back home going forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Professor Lumumba. And I don't know if anyone else has a comment there, but we really, really do have to begin to wrap it up. But what I can summarize from what has been spoken by Walter and you, Professor Lumumba, and probably Cuthbert will agree with me, and CAREL, is that if we are going to really, if Africa is going to rise in terms of tourism, we need to review how we tell our stories. Africa, we are not telling our stories well enough. We are not communicating to the rest of the world just what it is that we have to offer. As Danny had said, we have so much more to offer, so much more, but how are we telling those stories? We're not telling them enough. We'll keep on talking about the Serengeti until when? We can always start talking about what we have in the Serengeti. We've got the Tanzanites, we've got the experiences. People also go for the experiences. I'd just like to share very quickly, I visited Spain last year, in Barcelona in Spain. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about Barcelona was, the culinary experience. But then what were they drawing us into that experience? Their paella and the different, varieties of paella. That is just pilau and any other, African, Tanzanian, Rwandan, or any other rice mix, but they have really marketed their paella. And when you go to Spain, you're thinking, I can't leave Spain until I have my paella. So why don't we start marketing Africa in terms of, one, what we have to offer, the sites and everything, yes, but also the experiences. In Tanzania, we have something called Chips Mayai. It is amazing. It is sold all over the place. We can turn that into an experience. We have, I don't know, between all of the African nations that have tuned in today, I'm sure we could think of so many experiences that we can turn into, we can just monetize and just change the story for Africa altogether. So yeah, Cuthbert, do you have anything to add on to that one before we wrap up? We really need to change the narration and focus and home in on how are we communicating about what Africa has to offer. We need to change that. Brochures that shows pictures, those are not good enough. We need to change the narration. Yeah.
True indeed.
In a minute, 1 minute I give you.
True indeed. I couldn't have said it better than Walter when he emphasized that now is the time to open our domestic, our national and our continental destinations. And Prof as well has said Africa has the better product. I will actually go beyond that and say, look, Africa has the best product to offer to our domestic clients, to our international clients. And also CAREL indicated really the pain we have when we look at the very conglomerate organization who benefited before our independence, and they are still benefiting. Yeah. Colleagues, necessity is the mother of inventions. That is what we need now in Africa. This has come true for many nations, save for the African nations. Wave on a wave of opportunities have hit us, producing absolutely nothing but an unparalleled desire to lodge deeper and deeper into servitude than creating our own solutions for our own needs. So ladies and gentlemen, my argument is simple. If every family and household managed to close themselves indoors and stay at home for the duration of this catastrophe and survive with minimal movement, I am therefore confident, thus persuaded to bring this before you this day. It is time for Africa to close herself and stay at home. Let us quarantine. Let's take quarantine measures. That are a lesson we cannot overlook. We have an economic pandemic that we experienced before this the pandemic within our continent. Our nations are malnourished in the house of so much gold, in the house of so much diamonds, in the house of so much rich and fertile soils, organic foods, layers and layers of chrome and platinum, and all natural forests and unprecedented natural beauty. This has afforded us time to pause. Each and every leader, this is a challenge we are giving. Let us pause and appreciate what we have, and then start appreciating what we can do for ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cuthbert. CAREL, 1 minute just to wrap up. I mean, what is it do you think that Africa should begin to do in order to start repositioning ourselves? We do need to start repositioning ourselves if we're ever going to recover, if we're ever going to go back on the road to recovery. 1 minute, what do you think Africa should do?
I think we have spoken lengthy about these issues, and this is the right time to act. And that being said, I wish to underscore to everybody that we can achieve anything as Africans, as long as it does not bother us who gets the credit. If we want to work together, we want to collaborate, we must move away from the mentality of getting credit as individuals or countries. Let us collaborate and work together. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a fantastic. Dr. MZEMBI, what are your final thoughts on that?
We spoke about African stories. Yes, we have lots of stories in Africa, but they are not branded. Mm-hmm. My parting off message is store it, brand it, and sell it. You can tell many stories. If they are not branded, they will not be packaged for selling. So we need to brand our stories and sell them. Secondly, it is very expensive to visit Africa, even amongst ourselves. So we must cut the cost of travel to each other and from external source markets into Africa. That is a huge inhibiting factor. So the issue of opening up once again and harmonizing our policies and making sure that we liberalize our skies while at the same time we are developing single African markets for the air transport sector becomes super critical. And finally, in the value chain of investment, we say visit, trade, invest. Trade and investment will not take place before a visit. So in the turnaround and rebranding of Africa going forward for the opportunities that we are seeing on the back of the adversity of COVID, we must place the visit in the forefront. and it must be a cost-effective visit. So we must cut the cost of travel between ourselves and from those outside Africa into us. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walter. Professor Lumumba, your parting words for us this afternoon. What does Africa need to do in order to really start the journey, the road to reinventing ourselves?
Yeah, going forward, I think we must be coordinated. The collaboration within the continent is going to be very important. I look forward to the implementation of Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We remove tariff and non-tariff barriers. We ensure that we focus more on value addition. If we are to earn the dividends of the fourth industrial revolution, African governments must invest more in research and development. We must also focus on agriculture, ensure that we include women in the development process, and we also ensure that our politics is oriented toward the improvement of the quality of people's lives. And we must allow Africans to move within the continent. I look forward to the introduction of the single passport. And once we do that, there is a sense in which we can reap the dividends that are there to be gained if we work together post-COVID, and also strengthen our pharmaceutical sector and improve our health sectors, coordination. And lastly, our brethren in the diaspora, there are 230 million of them. We don't just want a year of return as an event. We think that if each one of them were to contribute to the continent, then the 230 million, that is just slightly under the population of Nigeria. And they are some of our best men and women. We must bring them back home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lumumba. Ladies and gentlemen, to all our panelists, thank you so much. It has been absolutely outstanding. I mean, the conversation could go on and on and on, but we really do have to say goodbye. Thank you so much for all your insightful comments. Thank you for sharing with us. I am pretty sure that people have gained a lot of knowledge as a result of this session. For all the panelists, you have given us a run for our money. We have so many questions that we haven't touched on, but what we're going to do right now, I think I can say, is that our next session will probably be focused on one industry, because most of the questions have come from the tourism industry. That way we'll be able to give it more of a focus and really get in people, or rather specialists from other regions in Africa as well, just to get their insights. And I'd like to thank you so very much for joining us. It has been a fantastic hour. But before we go, I'd like to invite Roderick. Remember when we started this session, we had a panel question that asked, how optimistic are you of your business surviving post-COVID-19? So Roderick is going to pose that question again, just to have a feel of whether our panelists have changed their views after hearing from our speakers today. Roderick?
Thank you so much, Doris. Great moderation. Thanks for everybody from all the 47 countries plus from all over the world who are here. Thank you for your time. We appreciate you. So I'm just going to run down the question again, because it is very important. This is why we are here. This was an urgent meeting, and we had to meet to make sure that we get the insights. So our question went like this. We wanted to find out, how optimistic are you about your business recovering rapidly post-COVID-19 crisis? And the options we had one, are you not optimistic? Or you are somewhat optimistic, or already maybe you were very optimistic, or definitely maybe you're not uncertain. So let's see, according to our panel of experts who give so much insight and very productive information, let's see now if you have changed, or maybe you're still feeling somewhat the same. So I'm just going to give the results just right now. Okay, so 4% are now not optimistic after this great discussion. And 33% are somewhat optimistic, but they're still in between. And 53% are now feeling very optimistic, which means, wow, people really have gained a lot. And I see the uncertainty part is just 10%. So from optimistic to uncertain, 14%. Big cake goes to very optimistic. So well done, ladies and gentlemen. I think this was very, very productive. And we're looking forward for the second session, which is going to be explosive. And Doris said, right, we're going to be dissecting different industries one at a time. So if you have for any other further questions or contributions or any insights you'd like to share, feel free to email adim@srcagency.com. That is adim@srcagency.com. Thank you once again for joining us. This is Roderick Mpuvazi, sign out. Have a blessed day. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you go, Roderick, Danny, you have some final thoughts for us before we leave. Thank you very much. Danny?
Thank you, Doris. Just a quick word. First of all, this was really an amazing and very engaging and enlightening session. And I personally look forward to the next one. Just on behalf of our moderator, Doris, my good friend, the technical support team, they've done an amazing job. The overall planning and execution team that made this webinar possible, we'd like to just say a sincere word of thanks, especially to our distinguished panel of experts. I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure everybody else has as well. And to all of you who attended, thank you very much for being on board. We look forward to engaging with you again in the not too distant future, and we shall keep you posted. In the meanwhile, asanteni sana and God bless.
Bye-bye. Kwaherini.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.